Chances are the first time you ever played through a Pokemon game, it was with a starter Pokemon. They're the foundation of your team, the very first Pokemon you ever pick, and probably the Pokemon you have the most fondest memories with. But unfortunately, some starter Pokemon just suck. In some games, the gap between the worst one and the best one is pretty significant, while in others it's closer. And yes, I know they're technically called first partner Pokemon now, but nobody's gonna end up calling them that. They're starter Pokemon going forward, and they always will be. Figured if I didn't mention that, somebody would actually me about it, but whatever. We'll mainly focus on how good each starter Pokemon is when playing through the main series games. Let's take a look at the first starter Pokemon ever introduced in Pokemon Red and Pokemon Blue. The original games that somehow passed quality control with a list of bugs and glitches probably longer than this script, which also has the most iconic starter Pokemon as they were the very first ones. Bulbasaur, Squirtle, and Charmander are among some of the most popular Pokemon, with their evolution seen across all of Pokemon media, merchandise, and one in particular is very prominent when it comes to the trading card game, and is often the most sought after card in any set it's released in. And funny enough, despite all of the love that Charizard gets across Pokemon media, the worst starter option in Pokemon Red and Blue is actually its pre-evolution, Charmander. You wouldn't expect this from the most popular choice, but let me explain. Since the main focus of this video is using each starter Pokemon in the main series games, we have to talk about how the starter Pokemon do in the early sections of the game. Bulbasaur and Squirtle have the advantage when it comes to the first two gyms, with Bulbasaur also resisting the third gym leader, Lieutenant Surge's electric-type Pokemon. Sure, Bulbasaur won't be able to hit the early route bug types for super effective damage, however you could also just get a Pidgey early on, which makes Charmander's fire type attacks on those bug type Pokemon rather redundant, because in the early part of the game, anything weak to fire is also just weak to flying. Squirtle also has the added bonus of being the best Pokemon to start with in speedruns, and although Charmander is technically better than Bulbasaur in that category as well, Bulbasaur is still better for a casual playthrough in my opinion due to its type advantages in the early part of the game to hammer away at many of the early gym leaders. A newer player picking Charmander will struggle against Brock because Charmander gets no moves hit Brock, or Misty for that matter, for super effective damage, while also being weak to both of those gym leaders' best Pokemon. Although in the case for Misty, unless you battle your rival in Cerulean City before facing her gym, which pretty much every Generation 1 strategy guide I looked at advises against, you wouldn't have access to any grass-type Pokemon to hit Misty's Pokemon for super effective damage. It is true that fire types are often a premium in Pokemon games, with some of them having very few options for fire types. I'm looking at you, Pokemon Diamond and Pearl specifically. But overall in Generation 1, fire types aren't exactly needed to construct a strong team. Add on that once Charmander evolves into Charizard, it gains the flying typing, adding a 4x weakness to rock type moves, which are pretty common in the later half of the game. On top of the fact that by that point of the game, you would probably have a different flying type Pokemon on your team to use fly, like Pidgeotto, which is one of the first Pokemon you're going to encounter in the wild, or the vastly superior Fearow. As for Pokemon Yellow, you only have one starter option in Pikachu, I guess two technically in Eevee, although you can't actually pick the Eevee. So by default, the best and worst starter in Yellow version is just Pikachu. For Generation 2, there really isn't much of a difference for when it comes to Gold, Silver, or Crystal, so everything I say will apply to all three of these Generation 2 Pokemon games. One interesting thing about the final form Generation 2 starters though is that they share the same stat numbers as their Generation 1 counterparts. For example, Charizard and Typhlosion have the same exact stats in fact, despite functioning as very different Pokemon, while Meganium and Venusaur have their defense and special attack flipped, while Blastoise and Feraligatr have the same base stat total, but every stat is swapped around except for speed, which remains the same, but the number values are still the same for each stat that these two Pokemon have. This one might be a bit more obvious, partly because it's in the thumbnail and was one of the main inspirations for this video, but the worst starter Pokemon to pick in a Generation 2 Pokemon game is Chikorita. And honestly, it's really not even that close. There's a common meme that Chikorita is often left out, and while it's cute and I personally tend to pick it a lot myself when I play through a Generation 2 game, it's just significantly worse than Cyndaquil and worse than Totodile even. Both of the other starters are stronger offensively, and while Meganium might have the edge defensively, as Meganium is supposed to be more like a support Pokemon, Chikorita being a grass type doesn't help at all for the first gym as it's flying type, or for the second gym because it's bug type, while against Whitney, the third gym leader, you might think that Chikorita's defense will help you out. By this point, it might even be a Bayleaf, but even Bayleaf can't handle Whitney's Intrepid Miltank, tank in all of its horror stories too well. Then for Morty's gym following Whitney, all of his Pokemon are part poison type and resist grass as well. Then you add on the fact that Jasmine's steel types resist grass, Price is an ice type gym leader that hits grass super effective, then Claire's dragons also resist grass. You probably won't be using Chikorita very much in the gym battles at all, which says a lot because it's your starter Pokemon and gym battles are some of the most important fights in the entire game. Many of the Team Rocket grunts will have poison type Pokemon too, like Golbat or Coughing, to also hit your Chikorita very hard. The only non-offensive grass type coverage move Meganium gets in Generation 2 are Rock Smash, if Rock Smash even counts, it's base 20 power, Iron Tail, Earthquake, and Fury Cutter, with the only decent move out of these being Earthquake. Now I do understand that Meganium is supposed to be defensive and more of a support Pokemon since it does have access to Reflect, Light Screen, Safeguard, and other support moves, but that just doesn't work too well when you take into account the gym leaders and the evil team, and with how awful Chikorita is in the early game, it's by far the worst. If you really want a grass-type Pokemon on your team early on in Generation 2, go catch a Hoppip or a Bellsprout. Both of them are available very early on. For Generation 3, the worst starter Pokemon is less obvious than it was for Generation 2. Don't worry though, because it's definitely not Mudkip, as we do like Mudkips around here. Mudkip is in my opinion the best due to its overall bulk, the ground typing it gets upon evolution, and access to all of the water HM moves that you will be needing a lot when traveling through the Hoenn region. What you certainly won't be needing while traveling through the Hoenn region though is Trico. I always liked Trico though, since Ash used it in the anime. I even drew these horrible drawings of it as a kid, and I picked Trico when I first played through Sapphire version after losing my Ruby version as a kid. I know it's been 20 years, but I'm still not over that. And as a side note, I lost my Ruby version 20 years ago, and I was trying to find my Sapphire version for another video I'm working on, and I also can't find that. Trico suffers for a few reasons in the Generation 3 games though, even if it can hit the first gym leader, Roxanne's rock types, for super effective damage. Trico, and by association Sceptile, are a victim of a mechanic you've probably heard a lot when it comes to the pre-Generation 4 Pokemon games, and it's most prevalent in Generation 3, but that's the physical and special split for moves. Prior to Generation 4, all Fire, Water, Electric, Ice, Grass, Psychic, Dark, and Dragon type moves were all considered special attacking moves, while all Normal, Fighting, Flying, Ground, Rock, Ghost, Poison, Bug, and Steel type moves were physical moves. This does at least mean that all of Sceptile's stab grass type moves are special, but many of its coverage options are physical moves, with Sceptile's attack stat being the weaker of the two offensive stats. In fact, the only special move that Sceptile has access to that isn't a grass type move is Dragon Claw, which only hits dragons super effective, and Pursuit, which is only a 40 base power dark type move best used when the enemy switches out, but NPCs very rarely switch out anyway, mainly because they'll never be scared of a Sceptile to want to have to switch. I will say that Sceptile isn't nearly as bad as Meganium though, and the gap between Sceptile and the other two starters in Hoenn isn't as big as the gap between Meganium and the other two starters in its game though. Trico really isn't all that bad, it's just the worst of the three. Trico does have the edge in being the coolest looking of the three though, which doesn't help it at all in battle, but it does maybe count for something. FireRed and LeafGreen were the first remakes in this series, upgrading Red and Blue to the new mechanics such as abilities, held items, and running. They also had the foresight to buff Charmander for Brock's gym, giving it access to the move Metal Claw to have a move to deal with its rock type super effectively. While this is a nice upgrade, it doesn't help much at all in the grand scheme of things, still making Charmander the worst option in Kanto overall, as the rest of the game plays out mostly the same as Red and Blue, just minus all the weird bugs and glitches. Moving on to Generation 4, aka the best generation, or my favorite generation, and I'm totally not biased because I'm currently soft resetting for a Shiny Turtwig for over 4 months now in Platinum version. I'll get it soon, don't worry, I swear, I'm not crazy. But for the starter options, we have Piplup, Chimchar, and of course, Turtwig. Since Diamond and Pearl have a whopping 2 whole Fire-type Pokemon, Chimchar is pretty good since it makes up 50% of the Fire-type Pokemon you could get in this game, and Fire types are pretty good in the Sinnoh region. Empoleon has access to many HMs, Piplup hits the first gym for super active damage, and while it is weak to Gardenia's Grass-type Pokemon of the second gym, it does at least get access to the move Peck by then to help out a little bit. Empoleon is a solid option though, and that means for the 3rd time in the row, the worst starter Pokemon in Diamond and Pearl is, drumroll please, the Grass-type Pokemon Turtwig. Yay. While it can also hit Rorik's gym for super active damage, as it's the first gym, All 3 starters in Diamond and Pearl can do that to some capacity. Piplup is a water type, and then Chimchar evolves to Monferno, which learns some fighting type moves. Torterra is also the only one of the 3 starters have a 4 times weakness in ice, and while ice types aren't the most common, you'll encounter them a fair bit towards the end of the game, especially around Snow Point City and against the 7th gym leader, whose name I just can't remember and nobody can seem to remember what her name is. To be honest, grass type kinda just sucks overall, and Turtwig is no exception, getting the short end of the stick yet again. No pun intended there. It's still my favorite of the 3 though, and hopefully soon I can get this silly shiny Turtwig in Platinum. I'm about to encounter one right now. Is it gonna be shiny? Is it gonna be shiny? Is it gonna be shiny? Oh, dude, it'd be so epic if I got it on camera while recording a video. But it's not shiny. Still. After 4 months. Now for HeartGold and SoulSilver, we journey back to the Johto region where a lot has changed. Pokemon now follow you, the mechanics from Generation 2 were updated to make the game feel more modern, you can run and connect online now, but one thing that did not change is the worst starter option is still you, Chikorita. I'm sorry, Chikorita, nobody loves you. I mean, I kinda love you, but really nobody loves you. And to be honest, it's for a lot of the same reasons as to why it was the worst in Gold, Silver, and Crystal. At least it gets a slight offensive buff this time with the Overgrow ability to boost its grass type attacks when its HP is low, but the other 2 starter Pokemon get a very similar ability as well to help with their stab type moves. And to make it even worse, Meganium can't even use Earthquake against Morty's Haunter and Gengar anymore because they have the Levitate ability now, which makes them immune to ground type moves. While newer generations introduce new mechanics and moves that benefit some Pokemon, in some instances, like this one, it can make a Pokemon even worse. So sorry Chikorita, but in both games you appear as a starter in, you're the worst in both. Now we can move on to Generation 5 with Pokemon Black and White, which were so good they were the only Pokemon games to get a direct sequel, which were also different enough, so we'll talk about those separately after this one. This generation also has very comparable starters, as they're all just pretty decent. None of them were too good or too bad competitively, don't worry, we'll get to that later on when we talk about Sun and Moon. And none of them have glaring flaws or weaknesses. I would say that Tepig is the best though due to Emboar being strong offensively and pretty good defensively. On top of that, the classic combo of fire and fighting type provides some good offensive options. As for Superior and Samurott, they are both mono type, which usually doesn't bode well for starter Pokemon. I'm looking at you, Meganium. And it's a tough call to say which is the worst of these 2, but I'm going to have to say Snivy. Maybe this is where my bias shows a bit more, as Oshawott is my favorite starter Pokemon out of all of the starter Pokemon. But grass types are still pretty bad even in Generation 5. No matter which starter you pick in Black and White, you will have a disadvantage against the very first gym since you'll battle against one of the 3 gym leaders that have the elemental monkey that's good against your starter Pokemon. But the struggles for Snivy will start to show more against the 3rd gym with Berg's bug type Pokemon, then again in the 4th gym against Elisa, who has 2 annoying Emolgas with Aerial Ace. Superior is at least a fast Pokemon with base 113 speed, but has mediocre attacks out of just 75 in both attack and special attack, which is the main reason why I consider Snivy to be the worst starter Pokemon in Pokemon Black and White. Black and White 2 change a little bit about the Unova region. You can catch older Pokemon now, and the gym order is a bit different with a couple of new gym leaders even. None of the starters get any direct buffs or debuffs really as well. This time the struggles for Snivy are a bit different though, as you have to face the 2nd gym, Roxy and her poison types, then Berg and his bug types, followed by Elisa this time. Elisa only has 1 Emolga this time and it doesn't have a flying type attack at least, but it's still a bit of a struggle for our lone snaky friend, as Snivy is still the worst starter Pokemon in Black and White 2. With Pokemon X and Y, we have some of the most loved starters, right? Okay, well, everyone loves Greninja as it's one of the most popular Pokemon of them all, and it's clearly the best in these games, so that just leaves these 2. Delphox gets made fun of a lot, but at least it's a fire type and has good speed and special attack. Generally speaking, offense is more valuable than defense when playing through a game normally, and the coverage options Delphox has is pretty good with Stab Fire and Stab Psychic type moves. Then there's moves like Shadow Ball and Grass Knot as its only real coverage options. Admittedly, its move pool isn't as wide as I originally thought, and then there's this guy, Chestnut, and my association Chespin have to be the most forgettable starter Pokemon out there. Back when Pokemon X and Y were the newest Pokemon game, barely anybody that I knew picked Chespin, as most people opted for Froakie, with some people picking Fennekin, because at least Fennekin is a cute little fox and not whatever this is. What even is Chespin though? When I first saw it revealed back when X and Y first got announced, I actually thought it was a fake Pokemon because of how weird it looked. Its middle evolution is even more weird though. Notice how I didn't name Chespin's middle evolution? That's because it's so forgettable, I'd be willing to bet that a good chunk of people watching this video don't even know what this Pokemon's name is. Let's take a guess. Is it A, Chesshog, B, Chessharp, or C, Cooladin? It's C, Cooladin. Kinda weird how Cooladin doesn't follow the same name scheme as its evolution or pre-evolution, but let's just talk more about why Chespin and its evolutions are the worst in X and Y. First, it's a grass type, which are cursed, and it's weak against the first gym as Viola uses bug type Pokemon, and now the second gym leader, Grant, is technically a rock type gym leader, but he uses Tyrunt, which is part dragon making it neutral to grass, and Amora, which is part ice type and super effective to grass type Pokemon. Sure, Chestnut is part fighting type, but you won't have a Chestnut by the time you fight the second gym. Then after Grant, you have to fight Karina, who has a Hawlucha with Flying Press, and Ramos has a Jumpluff and a Weeping Bell in a grass type gym, full of grass type Pokemon that are just superior to Chespin. Team Flare also uses fire type Pokemon, giving Chespin a similar issue Meganium has in Generation 2, being useless in so many key fights and against the evil team as well. So if you play through Pokemon X and Y, picking either Froakie or Fennekin isn't a terrible idea, but if you pick Chespin, good luck. Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire revamp Hoenn, adding Mega Evolution and changing the story around to reflect that. In doing so, we saw Sceptile and Swampert gain Mega Evolutions, joining Blaziken, who got a Mega Evolution in X and Y. And Blaziken is by far the best of the Mega Evolutions. The physical and special split does help out all of the starters now, especially Sceptile, which also gains the Dragon typing upon Mega Evolution. This gives it a 4x weakness to Ice, but having another stab option is pretty nice. Although now that I think about it, I don't think gaining access to Dragon Stab, a type that is only super effective against Dragon, is worth gaining a 4x weakness to Ice. Sure, Ice isn't super common, but 4x weaknesses are never good. You can use these Mega Evolutions in the main story pretty early on, which is neat, but overall if all three receive buffs and Sceptile didn't get the best buffs, it's still going to be the worst of the three, just like it was in Ruby and Sapphire and Emerald. It's not bad by any means, and it's definitely one of the least bad starter options in this video, if that makes any sense. Just not as good as Swampert or the king that was Mega Blaziken in Generation 6. And now we can move on to Generation 7 with Pokemon Sun and Moon, as well as the Ultra game, since they're basically the same exact game. You guys finally did it! You got me to play Pokemon Sun and Moon for a video again. I've been avoiding this for so long, but we can start off by discussing which starter definitely is not the worst, and that's Incineroar, mainly because fire types are almost always good in game, and Incineroar warped the competitive Pokemon scene ever since it was first introduced, as it's one of the best competitive Pokemon, period. So that just leaves Rowlet and Popplio. This one is one of the toughest ones for me to call, partly because these are the games I played the least, although I have played through each of these games at least once with each starter option before making this video. Originally I thought it was Popplio, and in my early notes I wrote about Popplio being the worst, but the more I thought about it, looking at the trial captains as well, and how Rowlet would even struggle against the water type one because of Arachnoid, I'm more inclined to say that Rowlet is the worst of the three now. Popplio is at least very strong against Kiawe and can hit some other captains for pretty okay damage, while Rowlet even struggles against the one captain it should be the best against. It is at least the cutest of the three, if that counts for anything. Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee also only have one starter each, so Pikachu and Eevee are simultaneously the worst starter and the best starter in their respective games, so there's that, I guess. Unlike the previous three Pokemon games, Pokemon Sword and Shield bring back the normal formula of having 8 normal regular gyms, and also 3 different starter options instead of 1 that we saw in Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee. I also had a pretty difficult time finding the worst starter for these games as well. All of the starters are mono-type, much like how it was in Generation 2, and I would say Scorbunny is the best by a little bit. Sure, I did pick Scorbunny in my very first playthrough of Sword and Shield, but it does stand the best against the first gym. The gyms in Sword and Shield start a bit later than in older Pokemon games, with Milo's Ace being about level 20, which is usually about the level of the second gym in previous Pokemon games. This gives you more opportunities to flesh out your team and cover your weaknesses, especially with access to the wild area so early on, as even Scorbunny will struggle against the second gym leader, Nessa, and her water-type Pokemon. As for Grookey, I would say that this is the time that grass-type Pokemon catch a break, as I'm going to have to say that Sobble is the worst in Sword and Shield. It'll struggle against the first 2 gyms more than the other 2 starters would, and while this doesn't have anything to do with how good the Pokemon is in the game, I just think that the whole evolutionary line of Sobble looks pretty dumb. All 3 of these starters are pretty decent though, and I don't think starting with Sobble will make the game that much harder, but it will be harder to look at this ugly Pokemon all the time. If you want to talk about starters that are not equal, let's move on to Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, where we travel back to the Sinnoh region. We have Turtwig again, And not really much has changed with BDSP over Diamond and Pearl aside from it being much easier to bump into walls and fire types being a bit more common thanks to the Sinnoh Underground. Overall, it doesn't really change anything for Turtwig though, as it's still the worst in the Sinnoh region, just in 3D now. Following Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, we have Legends Arceus where we stay in the Sinnoh region. Sort of. It's Hisui now, or was Hisui, but same thing, you know what I mean. Instead of 3 brand new starter Pokemon, as this isn't exactly a new generation, we have 3 different older starters from other regions in Cyndaquil, Rowlet, and Oshawott. This time their final evolutions have Hisuian forms, which give them a different typing, and the overall mechanics of this game are different from traditional main series Pokemon games, which make them interact differently. Battling also isn't as much of a focus in Legends Arceus as it was in other Pokemon games, but there are still some key boss fights that you will need your starter Pokemon against. Now you might think that Rowlet is the worst of the 3 since it was the worst in Sun and Moon and Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, but Hisuian Decidueye being a grass and fighting type helped it out a lot, while Samurott sees a similar buff getting the dark typing, which gives it some extra resist and the psychic type immunity. As for Hisuian Typhlosion, however, it gains the Ghost typing, which is nice to give it immunity to normal types and fighting types, but the additional Ghost typing doesn't help Typhlosion as much as the additional typing helped the other 2 starter Pokemon. While I would say that the starter Pokemon you pick matters the least in Legends Arceus based off how the game works because of the lack of gyms and the lack of a lot of fighting, I would still say that Cyndaquil is the worst option of this game, but at least Hisuian Typhlosion looks really cool. Then finally, we have what seems to be the undisputed best Pokemon games in the entire franchise, Pokemon Scarlet and Pokemon Violet. All of the starters in this game are pretty cool, like Fuecoco, this cute little crocodile guy, Quaxly, this adorable duck with a silly hat, then Sprigatito, a green cat. Yeah, I'm not going to beat around the bush with this one, but Sprigatito this time is the worst because, again, grass types just suck. You're going to struggle against 4 of the 5 first gyms in Scarlet and Violet with Sprigatito because they either resist grass or have a Pokemon that will completely destroy a grass-type Pokemon, like Larry Staraptor. And trust me, that happened to me a lot when I first played through this game. Sprigatito's final form, Meowscarada, is just a weird and creepy looking Pokemon too. Like, I'm not saying I'll judge you for what your favorite Pokemon is, but if you tell me your favorite Pokemon is Meowscarada, I'm gonna judge you. Now, I did use one on my first playthrough, so maybe I'm a bit of a hypocrite when it comes to Scarlet and Violet. But when I say I picked it as my starter, I mean, I picked it alright, but I certainly didn't battle with it a lot. And I didn't send it out as much as cooler Pokemon in the region like Espathra or Smoliv, which is the superior Generation 9 Grass-type Pokemon. So yeah, that's the worst starter Pokemon in each game, at least in my opinion. I'm sure some people will disagree, I'm sure I did some wrong, and if you want to support the channel, consider leaving a like and subscribing, or just don't, I guess. I don't know, I'll just pick up my DS again and start software setting for a Turtwig again, and hopefully get a shiny.